The Alpha King signed a marriage contract blindly, then faced the bride, and his wolf kneeled. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Ethan Blackwood had ruled for years with a steady hand and a measured voice. A leader known more for restraint than spectacle, and on this winter morning, he stood beneath the vaulted ceiling of the old council hall, where the light filtered through tall windows like pale ribbons of promise, illuminating a single document laid upon the oak table before him. The marriage contract waited there, written in careful script, sealed by ancient law and modern necessity, and every advisor in the room knew the rule as well as he did. The Alpha King would sign without seeing the bride, trusting the covenant to serve the realm before the heart. Ethan rested his palm on the wood, feeling the grain beneath his skin, steadying himself not with doubt, but with duty, because duty had always answered faster than emotion. The hall was quiet, not tense but expectant, the kind of quiet that follows long preparation, and as he picked up the pen he thought of borders secured, trade protected, and a future balanced on the smallest decisions. He signed, deliberately, without flourish, and when the ink dried it felt less like a leap and more like a continuation of the path he had always walked. Somewhere behind the curtain that divided the room, Lena Whitmore waited, her presence known but unseen, an omega chosen not for display but for alignment, a name spoken in ledgers rather than gossip. And as the seal was pressed into wax, the air shifted in a way no one could measure. Ethan straightened, the contract complete, and only then did the steward gesture toward the curtain, inviting the moment the law allowed. The moment when the Alpha King would finally face the woman whose name now shared his future. He turned, calm and composed, expecting nothing more than formality, but the first breath he drew as the curtain moved carried something unfamiliar, not a scent he could name, but a sense of recognition that bypassed thought. Lena stepped forward with quiet poise, her posture respectful, her eyes steady, and in that instant Ethan felt the subtle pull of attention narrow, as if the hall itself leaned closer. He noted the details without judgment, the simplicity of her attire, the steadiness of her hands, the calm that did not seek approval, and beneath that measured observation something deeper stirred, a presence that belonged to instinct rather than strategy. His inner wolf, usually a distant compass, responded with a stillness so profound it felt like listening, and Ethan paused, not because he questioned the contract, but because something within him had recognized the truth before language could catch up. The advisors shifted, unsure why the moment stretched, while Lena held her ground with grace that asked for nothing. Ethan met her gaze fully, understanding that he had signed blindly by law, yet now stood at the edge of a revelation that required no vision at all, only the courage to acknowledge what had already chosen him. The silence that followed did not break. It settled, spreading through the council hall like winter light across stone, and Ethan Blackwood felt it press against his senses with a weight he had not expected. He had faced rooms like this before, rooms filled with people waiting to measure his reaction, but this time the stillness was not political. It was personal. Lena Whitmore stood a few feet away from him, close enough that he could see the faint rise and fall of her breath, far enough that no rule was broken, and yet the distance felt carefully chosen, as if the space itself had been negotiated by instinct rather than law. Ethan became acutely aware of the way his shoulders had tightened, of the way his inner wolf had gone quiet in a way that was not submission but attention, the kind that sharpened the senses and demanded patience. The steward cleared his throat softly, reminding the room that protocol still existed, and Ethan nodded once, granting permission for the formal introductions that everyone pretended were still necessary. Lena inclined her head, not too low, not defiant, simply correct, and her voice, when she spoke her name, was steady without being rehearsed. Ethan listened, not just to the sound, but to what lay beneath it, an absence of fear that unsettled him more than open challenge ever had. He realized then that she was not trying to impress him, and that realization shifted something fundamental in the way he perceived the moment. Advisors exchanged glances, some curious, some skeptical, all of them searching Ethan's expression for reassurance that this marriage, arranged without spectacle, had not been a mistake. Ethan felt the familiar urge to reassure them, to speak a sentence that would settle the room, but his attention returned to Lena before the thought could form, and he found himself asking a simple question about her journey, a question no one had prompted him to ask. Lena answered honestly, mentioning the distance she had traveled, the long hours measured in miles rather than comfort, and the calm way she described it carried no complaint, only fact. As she spoke, Ethan sensed the faintest response from his wolf, not a surge, not a command, but a recognition that hummed like a low note held just beneath hearing. He shifted his weight, grounding himself, because an alpha did not react to instincts in public without reason, and yet he could not deny that something in him was aligning, adjusting, as if a compass needle had found true north without warning. The council chamber seemed smaller now, the vaulted ceiling less imposing, the oak table behind him suddenly irrelevant, because the contract had already done its work and what remained could not be amended by ink. Lena met his gaze again, and in her eyes he saw no triumph, no expectation, only readiness, the kind that came from someone who had learned to stand without guarantees. Ethan understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that whatever this bond became, it would not be shaped by obligation alone. He gestured toward the adjoining corridor, signaling the end of the formal session, and as the advisors slowly withdrew, murmuring among themselves, Ethan remained where he was, allowing the space to empty until only he and Lena stood beneath the fading winter light, both aware that the quiet between them was not emptiness at all, but the beginning of something neither of them could yet name. They walked side by side through the corridor, their steps measured, the stone beneath their feet polished smooth by centuries of similar passages, and Ethan found himself aware of the rhythm of Lena's pace, without meaning to be. It matched his, neither hurried nor hesitant, and that small alignment felt more significant than any vow spoken aloud. Servants passed at a respectful distance, eyes lowered, sensing a boundary they did not need explained, and the quiet that followed them was unforced, the kind that comes when no one dares interrupt a turning point. Ethan led them into a smaller antechamber warmed by a hearth that had not yet been lit for the day, the air cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine from the outside grounds. He gestured toward a pair of chairs positioned near a tall window, offering choice rather than command, and Lena accepted with a nod that acknowledged both courtesy and independence. As they sat, the light shifted across the room, and Ethan realized he was studying her reflections in the glass more than her features directly, noticing how she held herself as if she had learned long ago that dignity did not require permission. He spoke again, this time about the expectations of the court, not as a warning but as information, outlining schedules, responsibilities, and the public appearances that would follow in the coming weeks measured in days and miles traveled between strongholds. Lena listened carefully, asking questions that revealed attention to detail rather than anxiety, and her calm responses made Ethan aware of a tension he had carried for years without noticing, a constant readiness that now eased slightly. When she spoke of her past, she did so without embellishment, mentioning places she had lived, work she had done, and the lessons that came from standing quietly while others underestimated her, and Ethan recognized a strength that did not announce itself. His inner wolf stirred again, not loudly, not with dominance, but with a steady warmth that settled behind his sternum, as if confirming a truth already known. He paused mid-sentence, collecting himself, aware that the room felt closer now, not in distance but in focus, and he chose his next words carefully, acknowledging that the contract bound them by law, while leaving space for trust to develop without demand. Lena met that honesty with her own, stating clearly that she did not expect affection to be immediate, only respect, and the clarity of her boundary felt like an anchor rather than a barrier. Ethan found himself nodding, a gesture of agreement that surprised him in its ease, and as the moment stretched he noticed how natural it felt to remain present rather than retreat into authority. Outside the window, a flag shifted with the breeze, marking the passing hours, and Ethan realized that time had moved without him counting it, a rare occurrence. He stood and offered to show her the private wing that would be hers should she wish it, making the choice explicit, and Lena rose as well, her expression thoughtful but unafraid. As they moved toward the door, Ethan felt the quiet certainty settle deeper, not as a claim, but as a promise waiting to be understood, and he knew that whatever the court expected next, the most important work would happen here, in measured conversations and shared silences, where neither rank nor assumption could speak louder than what his wolf already recognized as true. The private wing unfolded before them with understated elegance, wide hallways softened by muted colors and tall windows that looked out over the inner gardens, and Ethan noticed how Lena paused just once, taking in the space without awe or suspicion, as if she were measuring not its luxury, but its intention. He explained quietly that the rooms had been prepared long ago for a future queen whose preferences were unknown, and Lena listened with the same thoughtful attention she had shown earlier, running her fingers lightly along the back of a chair, as if grounding herself in the present. The air carried a gentle warmth now, the hearths here already lit, and the faint crackle underscored the calm that settled between them. Ethan felt the pull again, subtle but persistent, a sense that his wolf was not urging him forward or back, but asking him to remain exactly where he was, present and honest. Lena turned toward the window, gazing out at the gardens below, where gravel paths curved between evergreen hedges, and she spoke of her fondness for quiet spaces, for mornings that unfolded slowly rather than announcing themselves, and Ethan found himself listening not as a ruler cataloging preferences, but as a man learning the rhythm of another life. He responded by sharing details he rarely voiced, the way he rose before dawn to walk the perimeter, the way responsibility felt lighter when the world was still, and as the words left him he realized how rarely he allowed such admissions. The connection did not spark like fire, it settled like embers, steady and enduring, and the realization surprised him with its rightness. A soft knock interrupted them, a reminder that the court moved on its own schedule, and Ethan acknowledged it with a glance before turning back to Lena, explaining that the formal announcement would take place by evening, measured in hours rather than spectacle. Lena accepted the information calmly, though he noticed the faint tightening of her hands, not fear but awareness, and he respected her enough to name it, telling her that scrutiny would come, but that she would not face it alone. The words were not a promise made lightly, and his wolf responded with a quiet affirmation that resonated through him. They moved deeper into the wing, stopping before a door that opened onto a sitting room bathed in afternoon light, and Ethan offered her this space as her own, emphasizing choice again, a theme he realized was becoming important to both of them. Lena stepped inside, turning slowly, and when she faced him, there was a question in her eyes that did not need words, a question about trust, about whether this consideration would endure beyond the first day. Ethan answered it not with reassurance, but with consistency, remaining steady, unhurried, allowing silence to do its work. Outside, a bell chimed faintly, marking the hour, and Ethan knew that soon the court would gather, opinions forming before facts could catch up. Yet here, in this quiet room, the future felt less like a burden and more like a shared responsibility. Lena nodded once, a small but decisive gesture, and Ethan felt the alignment deepen, not binding but chosen, and as they stood there together, he understood that the contract had set the path, but it was this measured exchange, built on respect and unspoken recognition, that would determine how they walked it together. As the hour approached for the evening announcement, a subtle restlessness settled over the private wing, not from noise but from anticipation, and Ethan felt it first as a shift beneath his ribs, a quiet insistence that asked for acknowledgement rather than control. He excused himself briefly to attend to preparations, leaving Lena with attendants who moved with careful neutrality, and as he walked the corridor alone, he realized how unusual it felt to be separated from her presence after such a short time. The sensation did not unsettle him, it clarified him. His inner wolf stirred again, not with urgency, but with a calm gravity that urged awareness, as if reminding him that leadership required listening to more than voices. He paused at a window overlooking the courtyard, measuring the distance below in familiar terms, a few dozen yards across, the kind of space he had crossed thousands of times, and he breathed deeply, grounding himself in routine while allowing the truth to surface. This was not infatuation, not impulse. It was recognition unfolding at its own pace. When he returned, he found Lena standing near the window of her sitting room, the late afternoon light outlining her profile, and she turned as he entered, reading his expression with quiet perceptiveness. He told her that the court would gather soon, that expectations would be voiced before understanding caught up, and that his role would be to set the tone, to make it clear through action rather than proclamation where authority stood. Lena accepted this without dramatics, asking instead where she should stand, not physically but symbolically, and the question struck him with its insight. He answered honestly, saying that she would stand beside him if she chose, not as ornament or obligation, but as partner in the eyes of those who mattered. The words resonated through him, affirmed by the steady warmth of his wolf, and he saw Lena consider them carefully before nodding once, a decision made without hesitation. As attendants announced the approaching hour, measured in minutes now, Ethan felt the alignment strengthen, his instincts settling into a rare harmony with his intent. They walked together toward the threshold that led back to the public halls. Their steps matched again, and with each step Ethan sensed the quiet approval of his wolf, not commanding him forward but affirming the path he had chosen. The doors ahead stood tall and familiar, the kind that had closed behind countless declarations, and Ethan placed his hand on the handle, pausing just long enough to meet Lena's gaze. In her eyes he saw readiness without bravado, courage without performance, and it steadied him more than any counsel ever had. As the doors opened and the murmur of the gathering court washed over them, Ethan felt the shift fully, a settling of instinct into certainty, and he understood that whatever judgments awaited them, his wolf had already made its choice. The realization did not demand immediate action. It promised patience, a strength that would reveal itself when the moment required, and as they stepped into the light together, Ethan carried that quiet truth with him, confident that recognition, once awakened, could not be undone. The great hall received them with a hush that spread faster than any herald's call, a living silence shaped by curiosity rather than fear, and Ethan felt it ripple outward as he took his place with Lena at his side. The gathered counselors, envoys, and senior aides stood in measured rows, their attention fixed not on the dais but on the space between the Alpha King and his newly bound partner, searching for clues in posture and breath. Ethan acknowledged the room with a nod, a practiced gesture that carried authority without excess, then waited, allowing the moment to settle before any words were spoken. Lena stood with composed stillness, her hands relaxed, her gaze level, and Ethan noted how naturally she occupied the space beside him, not shrinking from attention nor courting it. The steward announced the formalities with careful diction, measured in minutes rather than spectacle, and as names and titles flowed, Ethan listened with half an ear, his focus drawn inward where his wolf maintained that steady warmth, alert and calm. When the announcement reached its turning point, the declaration of the union bound by contract and law, a murmur moved through the hall, restrained but unmistakable, and Ethan felt the subtle pressure of expectation press against his shoulders. He responded not by raising his voice, but by grounding it, speaking clearly and fully, affirming the legality of the bond and the intention behind it, emphasizing continuity and stability in language the court understood. As he spoke, he sensed Lena's attention align with his cadence, not echoing but reinforcing, and the effect was immediate, the murmurs easing into attentive quiet. Questions followed, formal and indirect, framed as concerns for protocol and precedence, and Ethan answered them with concise assurance, choosing clarity over elaboration. Through it all, his wolf remained present, a constant undercurrent that did not push him forward but anchored him, reminding him to remain honest. When a senior counselor's gaze lingered too long on Lena, assessing rather than acknowledging, Ethan felt the warmth deepen, not as warning but as resolve, and he shifted slightly, a subtle repositioning that placed himself unequivocally beside her. The message was clear without being spoken, and the room adjusted, attention recalibrating. Lena met the scrutiny with quiet composure, responding when invited, her words measured and respectful, revealing insight without defensiveness, and Ethan recognized the moment for what it was, the true test not of law but of perception. Time passed in steady increments, the evening light dimming through the tall windows, and as the final formalities concluded, The tension that had gathered began to release, not in applause but in acceptance. Ethan concluded the session with a brief statement, reaffirming unity and forward movement, then dismissed the assembly, allowing the hall to empty at its own pace. As voices faded and footsteps receded, he remained still for a moment, breathing evenly, feeling the alignment hold. Lena turned to him then, her expression thoughtful, and he saw in her eyes not relief but understanding, the shared awareness that this was only the beginning. Ethan inclined his head, acknowledging her steadiness, and as they stepped away from the dais together, he knew with quiet certainty that the path ahead would require patience and consistency, but also that the foundation had been set not by spectacle, but by recognition that neither of them had needed to force. The hall had nearly emptied when the moment arrived, not announced by sound, but by a shift Ethan felt deep within, a quiet pressure that asked for truth rather than restraint, and he realized that the stillness lingering after the council's departure was not an ending, but a threshold. Only a handful of attendants remained at the edges, gathering documents and extinguishing lamps, careful not to intrude, while the vast space seemed to breathe out, releasing what it had held. Ethan stood beside Lena at the foot of the dais, the polished stone cool beneath his boots, and for the first time since the doors had closed behind the council, he allowed himself to turn fully toward her. The light was softer now, amber instead of gold, and it revealed details he had not consciously noticed before, the calm resolve in her posture, the steady openness in her gaze. He was aware of the quiet again, but this time it was different, charged not with observation but with permission, and his wolf responded in a way he could no longer ignore. It was not a surge or a command, not a pull toward dominance or claim, but a profound recognition that settled through his body like gravity, finding its center. Ethan drew a slow breath, grounding himself, aware that this was a moment that could not be rushed or hidden, and as he did, his wolf stepped forward within him, not as a separate force but as an extension of his own truth. Without conscious decision, his posture shifted, shoulders lowering, stance widening slightly, and before he could question the instinct, he felt the unmistakable impulse to yield, not in weakness but in acknowledgement. In the quiet of the great hall, Ethan Blackwood bent one knee to the stone, a deliberate, controlled movement that carried no urgency, only certainty. The sound was soft, barely more than a whisper of fabric and breath, but it echoed in the stillness with unmistakable meaning. Lena inhaled sharply, not in fear but in surprise, and Ethan lifted his gaze to meet hers, his expression steady, unguarded, as his wolf completed the gesture through him, bowing not to rank or ritual, but to recognition. The attendants froze, their movements stilled by instinct, understanding that this was not something meant to be interrupted or explained. Ethan remained there, one knee grounded, his hands relaxed at his sides, feeling the alignment lock into place, a sense of rightness so complete it left no room for doubt. He did not speak at first, allowing the action to stand on its own, trusting that Lena would understand what no proclamation could convey. When he finally did speak, his voice was calm, unraised, carrying clearly through the hall without effort, telling her that this was not required by law, not demanded by contract, but chosen freely, an acknowledgement of what his wolf had already accepted. Lena stepped closer then, closing the distance with quiet assurance, and he felt her presence like an anchor, steady and real. She did not reach for him immediately, did not rush to respond, and Ethan respected that, remaining still, grounded, allowing the moment to belong to both of them. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but certain, acknowledging his gesture not as submission but as trust, and the word resonated through him more powerfully than any title ever had. Ethan rose smoothly, the movement unhurried, and as he stood before her again, the connection held, unbroken, strengthened by the simple truth that recognition, once given freely, could never be taken back. The great hall seemed larger now, not because of distance but because of possibility, and Ethan knew with absolute clarity that this moment, quiet and unadorned, would shape everything that followed. The stillness that followed did not fracture under whispers or hurried explanations. It transformed, flowing outward through the great hall and into the corridors beyond like a tide that carried meaning without needing words, and Ethan sensed the shift immediately, as something settled into place around them. Attendants resumed their movements slowly, careful and reverent, as if aware that what they had witnessed would ripple far beyond this room, and Ethan felt no need to stop them, trusting that the truth would carry itself. He turned with Lena toward the side passage that led back to the private wing, their steps unhurried, the echo of their footfalls soft against the stone, and for the first time that day, the weight he had carried as Alpha felt lighter, redistributed rather than diminished. As they walked, Ethan became aware of how naturally Lena matched his pace again, not adjusting to him, not asking him to slow, and the realization brought a quiet satisfaction that settled deep. When they reached the threshold of the private wing, he paused, allowing the doors to close behind them, creating a space free from observers, and he turned to face her fully, the connection between them steady and clear. He spoke then, not as ruler or symbol, but as himself, acknowledging the significance of what had occurred, clarifying that his wolf's recognition was not an end but a beginning, a foundation upon which trust would need to be built deliberately, day by day. Lena listened, her expression thoughtful, absorbing his words without rushing to respond, and when she did speak, she reflected that understanding back to him, naming the choice they now shared, a path neither of them had anticipated, but both were willing to walk with intention. The exchange felt balanced, neither heavy nor fragile, and Ethan felt his wolf settle again, content not because the bond was complete, but because it was respected. As the evening deepened outside, measured by the dimming light and the soft chiming of distant bells marking the hours, Ethan escorted Lena to her sitting room, not out of formality but consideration, and they spoke quietly of practical matters, tomorrow's schedule, the conversations that would inevitably follow, the way the court would reinterpret what it had seen through the lens of tradition and speculation. Ethan acknowledged that questions would come, not all of them kind, and Lena met that reality with calm resolve, stating clearly that she did not need the court's approval to stand where she was, only his consistency, and the clarity of her boundary resonated with him deeply. He assured her that consistency was something he understood well, perhaps better than most, and the shared understanding felt like another stone set into place. When he finally took his leave, the distance he created felt intentional rather than abrupt, and as he walked the corridor alone, Ethan reflected on how the meaning of strength had shifted for him in a single day, not away from authority, but toward balance. By the time he reached his own chambers, the truth had fully settled, that what the court would see in the coming days was not a spectacle to be defended, but a partnership to be demonstrated quietly, through action and respect. Ethan stood at the window for a moment, looking out over the moonlit grounds measured in familiar yards and pathways, and he felt his wolf present and calm, no longer restless, no longer questioning, simply aligned. Tomorrow, the realm would begin to understand what had changed, but tonight, the understanding belonged to him and to Lena alone, steady and unshakable, a shared certainty that required no witness to be real. Morning arrived without ceremony, the light slipping through tall windows and settling across the stone floors in pale bands that marked the passage of hours rather than announcing them, and Ethan stood quietly in the antechamber adjoining the private wing, aware that something fundamental had shifted during the night. The court would awaken with questions, the realm with rumors measured in miles of distance and days of interpretation, but here, in this quiet space, clarity held. Lena joined him moments later, her presence steady, her expression composed, and Ethan noted how naturally she moved through the space now, not as a guest, not as a symbol, but as someone who belonged by choice rather than decree. They shared a brief greeting, simple and unadorned, and the ease of it confirmed what neither of them needed to say aloud. Ethan spoke first, outlining the day ahead, meetings scheduled in measured intervals, paths through the grounds that would place them before the people not as spectacle, but as continuity, and Lena listened with the same focused attention that had marked every exchange between them. She responded thoughtfully, suggesting adjustments that reflected both awareness of perception and respect for substance, and Ethan recognized the balance they were beginning to form, a partnership defined not by hierarchy, but by shared intent. As they walked together through the inner gardens, the gravel paths crunching softly beneath their feet, Ethan felt his wolf present and calm, no longer urging, no longer testing, simply aligned, and the sense of rightness deepened with each step. The gardens stretched out in familiar patterns measured in yards and hedges, yet they seemed different now, not because the world had changed, but because his understanding of it had. Ethan paused near a stone bench overlooking a stand of evergreens, turning to Lena with deliberate calm, and spoke the truth he had been holding since the night before, that he had entered this union guided by law and responsibility, signing without sight because duty demanded it, but that what followed had not been written anywhere except within him. He acknowledged openly that his wolf had recognized her before his mind had caught up, and that the recognition was not something he intended to explain away or hide behind tradition. Lena met his honesty with her own, stating clearly that she had not sought recognition or elevation, only a place where her steadiness would not be mistaken for weakness, and the simplicity of her words resonated through him with unmistakable clarity. Ethan took a measured breath, feeling the weight and the promise of what lay ahead, and in that moment, with the morning light steady around them, he spoke the words that would anchor everything that followed, telling her that while his hand had signed blindly, his instincts had not, and that his wolf, which bowed not to crowns or contracts, saw her with absolute certainty. The statement was not dramatic, not raised for any audience beyond the two of them, but it carried the weight of a vow formed without ceremony, and Lena received it with quiet understanding, acknowledging not possession but partnership. As they turned back toward the palace together, the sounds of the waking court growing clearer with each step, Ethan felt a profound sense of completion not as an ending, but as a beginning defined by choice rather than obligation. The realm would interpret the kneeling, the signing, the silence in its own time, but the truth was already settled, carried forward not by proclamation, but by the steady presence of two people who had chosen to walk the path ahead with clarity and respect, and Ethan knew with unshakable certainty that what his wolf had recognized could never be undone.